Welcome to the channel, Stories of Slavery. Today, we're going back to 1860, to the story of Abigail Foster, a young black girl who could sew extraordinary clothing, turning scraps into pieces so beautiful they looked impossible. But behind every stitch, there was a life marked by pain control and a terrible truth that few were willing to see. This is a difficult and intense story. So, take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. In the spring of 1860, the wealthiest women of Charleston, South Carolina, gathered at the most exclusive dress shop on King Street. They whispered about a mysterious French seamstress, whose creations were unlike anything they had ever seen. The stitching was impossibly perfect. The designs were breathtaking. The fabrics seemed to flow like water. These dresses cost more than most working men earned in an entire year. Yet the waiting list stretched for months. Plantation wives, merchant daughters, and society matrons all competed for the privilege of wearing these magnificent gowns. But none of them knew the truth. None of them could have imagined that behind every silk ribbon, behind every delicate pearl button, behind every perfectly placed stitch, there was a 12-year-old black girl named Abigail, a child who had never worn shoes, a child who had never tasted freedom, a child whose extraordinary talent was being stolen, exploited, and hidden from the world. This is her story, and it will change the way you see everything. Charleston in 1860 was a city of contradictions. It was one of the wealthiest cities in America, built on the backs of enslaved people who outnumbered white residents by a significant margin. The harbor was constantly busy with ships carrying cotton, rice, and human beings. Grand mansions lined the streets south abroad, their elegant facades hiding the brutal reality of the people who made that wealth possible. The city had approximately 40,000 residents, and more than half of them were enslaved. This was a place where human beings were bought and sold at auction houses, located just blocks away from fancy restaurants and theaters. It was a city where a black person could be whipped for looking a white person in the eye. It was a city where families were torn apart every single day. And it was in this city on a sprawling estate, just outside the main commercial district, that Abigail Foster lived and suffered. The Foster family had been in South Carolina for 3 generations. They were not among the wealthiest plantation owners, but they considered themselves respectable. Richard Foster owned a modest cotton operation about 20 miles outside the city, along with a townhouse in Charleston, where his wife Margaret preferred to spend most of her time. Richard was a stern man in his 50s who believed that discipline was the foundation of everything. He had inherited 12 enslaved people from his father and had acquired another 15 through purchase and birth over the years. To him, these human beings were property, nothing more. They were tools to be used, maintained, and replaced when necessary. His wife Margaret was a different kind of cruel. She was obsessed with appearances, with status, with being seen as a lady of refinement and taste. She spent money they did not really have on dresses, jewelry, and parties. She wanted desperately to climb the social ladder of Charleston society, but the truly wealthy families looked down on her. She was not quite rich enough, not quite connected enough, not quite elegant enough. This frustration made her bitter, and she took that bitterness out on the people who could not fight back. Abigail was born in 1848 on the Foster plantation. Her mother, a woman named Ruth, worked in the main house as a cook and cleaner. Abigail never knew her father. He had been sold to another plantation owner when Ruth was still pregnant, and no one ever spoke of him again. This was common. Enslaved families were separated constantly, without warning, without mercy. Children grew up not knowing their parents. Parents lived their entire lives wondering what happened to their children. It was one of the countless cruelties of the system, designed to break the human spirit and prevent any sense of family or community that might lead to resistance. Ruth did everything she could to protect her daughter. She taught Abigail to be quiet, to be invisible, to never draw attention to herself. She taught her to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and to always keep her eyes on the ground. She taught her that survival meant submission, at least on the surface. But Ruth also taught her daughter something else, something secret, something precious. She taught her how to sue, on the surface. But Ruth also taught her daughter something else, something secret, something precious. She taught her how to sue. Ruth had learned to sue from her own mother, who had been brought to America on a slave ship from the west coast of Africa in 1795. That grandmother had been a skilled craftswoman in her homeland, creating elaborate textiles for ceremonies and celebrations. She carried that knowledge across the ocean, through the horror of the Middle Passage, and into the fields of South Carolina. She passed it down to her daughter, and her daughter passed it down to Ruth, and Ruth passed it down to Abigail. It was a chain of skill and artistry that stretched back across generations and continents. When Abigail was just 5 years old, Ruth began teaching her the basics: how to thread a needle, how to make a straight stitch, how to cut fabric without wasting a single inch. They practiced at night in the small cabin they shared with 4 other enslaved people, using scraps of cloth that Ruth collected from the main house. Margaret Foster threw away fabric constantly, disgusted by the smallest stain or imperfection. Ruth retrieved these scraps and used them to teach her daughter. It was dangerous. If they were caught, they would be punished. Enslaved people were not supposed to have skills beyond what their owners assigned them. But Ruth believed that knowledge was the one thing that could never be taken away. She was wrong about that. As it turned out, she could not have known. By the time Abigail was 8 years old, her skill with a needle was remarkable. Her stitches were tiny and even. Her sense of proportion was instinctive. She could look at a piece of fabric and see what it wanted to become. Ruth was amazed and terrified in equal measure. She knew that this talent could either save her daughter or destroy her. She prayed it would remain hidden. But in a household run by Margaret Foster, nothing stayed hidden for long. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1856. Abigail was 8 years old. Margaret had torn her favorite handkerchief on a rose bush in the garden, and she was furious. The handkerchief had been imported from France, embroidered with delicate flowers, and it had cost more than most people earned in a month. Margaret screamed at Ruth, demanding that she fix it immediately. Ruth tried. She was a competent seamstress, but this kind of fine embroidery was beyond her skill. Her stitches were visible. The repair was obvious. Margaret slapped her across the face and called her worthless. Abigail was in the corner of the kitchen, trying to be invisible, as her mother had taught her. But she could not watch her mother be humiliated. She could not watch her mother fail at something that Abigail knew she could do. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. She said, "I can fix it." 3 words that would change her life forever. Margaret turned to look at the small girl in the corner. She laughed. A child fixed French embroidery. Impossible. But Ruth's face had gone pale, and Margaret noticed. There was something here, some secret. She demanded that Abigail show her what she could do. Ruth begged. She actually got on her knees and begged Margaret not to make Abigail demonstrate her sewing. But Margaret was intrigued now, and nothing would stop her. She handed the torn handkerchief to the 8 8-year-old girl and watched. What happened next made Margaret Foster's eyes go wide. Abigail's small fingers moved with a precision that seemed impossible for a child. She matched the thread perfectly to the original embroidery. She replicated the flower pattern as if she had designed it herself. Within 20 minutes, the handkerchief looked better than new. The repair was invisible. Margaret examined it under a magnifying glass and could not find the stitches. She looked at the child standing before her, barefoot and thin and terrified, and she saw something she had never seen before. She saw an opportunity. The next morning, Abigail was taken from her mother. Ruth screamed and fought, and had to be restrained by 2 male enslaved workers. Abigail was carried to the back of the main house to a room that had been used for storage. It was small, about 10 ft by 12, with one tiny window near the ceiling that let in a sliver of light. There was a table, a chair, and a small cot in the corner. This would be Abigail's new home. This would be her prison. Margaret Foster stood in the doorway and explained the situation in her cold, precise voice. Abigail would sue. She would sue whatever Margaret told her to sue. She would work from dawn until Margaret was satisfied. If she did good work, she would be fed. If she did poor work, she would be punished. If she tried to escape or tell anyone about her situation, her mother would be sold to the worst plantation in the state. Abigail was 8 years old. She understood perfectly. She understood that she had just become a different kind of slave. Not a field worker, not a house servant, but something else entirely. A machine, a tool, a secret weapon in Margaret Foster's desperate climb toward social acceptance. The first year was the hardest. Abigail worked 16 hours a day, sometimes more. Her fingers bled until calluses formed. Her eyes ached from straining in the dim light. Her back cramped from hunching over the table. Margaret brought her projects constantly, demanding perfection. A dress that needed alterations, a tablecloth that needed embroidery, a set of napkins for a dinner party. Abigail completed each task with mechanical precision because the alternative was unthinkable. She saw her mother once a week on Sunday mornings for exactly 1 hour. These visits were supervised. They were not allowed to speak about Abigail's work. They were not allowed to embrace for more than a few seconds. Ruth would hold her daughter's hands and examine them for cuts and bruises. She would whisper, "I love you and stay strong and God is watching." Abigail wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that someone was watching, that someone cared, that this suffering had some purpose. But as the months passed, her faith began to fade. God seemed very far away from that small room with its sliver of light. By 1858, when Abigail was 10 years old, Margaret Foster had developed a plan. The dresses that Abigail created were extraordinary. They were better than anything available in Charleston. They were better than anything Margaret had seen in fashion magazines from Paris. If Margaret wore these dresses herself, she would certainly attract attention. But attention was not enough. She wanted money. She wanted power. She wanted to be someone who mattered. So, she approached a dress shop owner named Eliza Peon, a widowed woman who ran a small but respectable establishment on King Street. Margaret showed her one of Abigail's creations, a blue silk evening gown with hand-embroidered roses climbing up the bodice. Eliza Peon nearly fainted. She had never seen anything like it. She asked where it came from, who made it, how she could get more. Margaret smiled and lied smoothly. She said she had connections with a seamstress in Paris, a woman who had trained at the finest fashion houses, but preferred to work in obscurity. This seamstress would create exclusive designs for Eliza's shop for a substantial fee. Of course, the arrangement would be secret. No one could know where the dresses came from. It would add to the mystique, to the exclusivity, to the desirability. Eliza Peaton agreed immediately. She would have agreed to almost anything to sell gowns like that blue silk masterpiece. The first dress sold within 2 days. The buyer was the wife of a cotton factor, a man who arranged sales between plantation owners and textile mills. She paid $300, an astronomical sum. In 1858, she wore the dress to a ball at the St. Cecilia Society, the most exclusive social organization in Charleston. Within a week, every woman at that ball wanted to know where the dress came from. Eliza Peaton pretended to be reluctant, pretended the dresses were almost impossible to obtain, pretended that only the most discerning clients could even be considered for the waiting list. It was brilliant marketing. Demand exploded. Margaret Foster could barely contain her excitement. She returned to the small room where Abigail worked and informed her that production would need to increase. Abigail would now be creating 3 gowns per month instead of 1. The hours would be longer. The standards would be higher. There would be no margin for error. Abigail did not protest. She had learned that protest was pointless. She simply nodded and continued working. But something inside her was changing. She was no longer just a frightened child trying to survive. She was becoming something else. She was becoming an artist. Even in her misery, even in her exhaustion, even in her captivity, she found moments of something like joy. When she worked, when she saw a piece of fabric and imagined what it could become, when she solved a difficult technical problem with an elegant solution, when she finished a garment and knew with absolute certainty that it was beautiful. These moments were small, they were fleeting, but they were hers. Margaret Foster could steal her labor. Margaret Foster could steal her childhood. Margaret Foster could steal her freedom, but she could not steal the feeling that rose in Abigail's chest when she created something perfect that belonged to Abigail alone. The year 1859 brought changes to the Foster household. Richard Foster's cotton crop had failed due to heavy rains and an early frost. The family was in financial trouble. They owed money to banks, to suppliers, to other plantation owners. Richard wanted to sell some of their enslaved workers to cover the debts. He specifically mentioned Ruth. She was getting older. He said her value was declining. Better to sell now and get something for her. Margaret refused. Not because she cared about Ruth. Not because she worried about Abigail's emotional state. She refused because she understood that Ruth was leverage. As long as Margaret controlled Ruth, she controlled Abigail. And Abigail's hands were now the most valuable asset the Foster family possessed. The dress business with Eliza Peaton had grown enormously. They were now selling 10 to 15 gowns per month, each one priced between $200 and $500, depending on complexity. The profit was divided between Margaret and Eliza, with Margaret receiving the larger share. It was more money than the plantation had ever generated. It was keeping the family afloat. Richard Foster grumbled, but agreed to keep Ruth for now. He did not know where the money was really coming from. He did not know about Abigail's role. Margaret had kept that secret even from her own husband. She told him she had made some wise investments. He was too preoccupied with his failing crops to ask questions. Abigail turned 11 in 1859. She had been working in the small room for 3 years. She had created over 100 garments in that time. Dresses, cloaks, jackets, undergarments, accessories. Each one was a masterpiece. Each one was sold to wealthy white women who would never know her name. She had grown taller, but remained thin. Her diet was barely adequate. Margaret provided enough food to keep her working, but not enough to keep her healthy. Abigail suffered from headaches, from stomach pains, from a persistent cough that would not go away. She dreamed sometimes of running away. She had heard whispers about the Underground Railroad, about enslaved people who escaped to the north and found freedom. But she knew that running away meant abandoning her mother. It meant never seeing Ruth again. It meant condemning Ruth to whatever punishment Margaret would inflict. This was the trap. This was how the system worked. It used love as a chain. It used family as a cage. Abigail loved her mother too much to leave her, and so she stayed. The year turned to 1860. It was January and Charleston was buzzing with political tension. The election later that year would decide whether the nation would continue to tolerate slavery or attempt to restrict it. Southern politicians were already talking about secession, about breaking away from the United States and forming their own country, where slavery would be protected forever. Abigail heard fragments of these conversations through the walls of her small room. She did not fully understand the politics, but she understood the stakes. If the South won, her situation would never change. She would die in this room, working until her fingers could no longer hold a needle. If the North won, maybe, possibly someday, there might be freedom. It seemed impossibly distant. It seemed like a fairy tale. But she held on to it anyway because hope was all she had. In February of 1860, something unexpected happened. A new customer appeared at Eliza Peaton's dress shop. Her name was Elenina Whitmore, and she was different from the other wealthy women of Charleston. Elenina was from Boston originally, a city in Massachusetts, where slavery was not legal, and abolitionists openly advocated for the freedom of all enslaved people. She had married a Charleston merchant named Thomas Whitmore 5 years earlier, and had struggled to adapt to Southern society. She found the casual cruelty toward black people disturbing. She kept these feelings to herself, because expressing them would have made her life impossible. Her husband's business depended on relationships with plantation owners. Her social standing depended on acceptance by other wealthy wives. She had learned to stay quiet, but she had never learned to stop seeing. She noticed things that other white women ignored: the scars on the hands of the enslaved people who served her, the fear in their eyes when they made mistakes, the way they were spoken to. Like animals, like objects, like nothing at all. She noticed, and she remembered, and she filed everything away in her mind. Elenina Whitmore walked into Eliza Peaton's shop on a cold February morning because she needed a dress for the governor's ball in April. She had heard about the mysterious French seamstress whose creations were the talk of Charleston society. She was curious. When Eliza showed her the sample book, Eleanor was genuinely impressed. The designs were extraordinary. The craftsmanship was flawless. She ordered a gown in deep burgundy silk with gold embroidery, willing to pay whatever price was asked. But she also asked questions. Where exactly in Paris was the seamstress located? What was her training? How had Mrs. Foster discovered her? Eliza provided the standard vague answers. The seamstress valued her privacy. She worked through intermediaries. It was all very exclusive and mysterious. Eleanor smiled and nodded and paid her deposit. But something did not add up. She had lived in Boston near the garment district. She knew how dressmaking worked. She knew that even the most skilled seamstress needed a team of assistants to produce garments at this rate. She knew that transporting delicate gowns across the Atlantic Ocean would risk damage. She knew that the timeline Margaret Foster described was impossibly fast for overseas production. There was something wrong with this story, and Elenina Whitmore was not the kind of woman who could leave a mystery unsolved. Meanwhile, in her small room, Abigail was working on Elenina's dress without knowing anything about the woman who would wear it. She only knew that it was a special order, that Margaret had specified burgundy silk and gold thread, that the deadline was 6 weeks away. She had done this dozens of times before. She would create something beautiful, and it would disappear and she would never know who wore it, or what they thought of it. But this dress felt different somehow. Abigail could not explain why. Maybe it was the quality of the fabric, which was finer than anything she had worked with before. Maybe it was the color, that deep, rich burgundy that reminded her of something she could not quite remember. Maybe it was simply that she was tired, that her mind was wandering, that she was allowing herself to imagine things she normally kept locked away. She imagined the woman who would wear this dress. She imagined her dancing at a beautiful ball. She imagined her feeling confident and elegant and admired. She imagined her being happy. These were dangerous thoughts. These were the kind of thoughts that led to despair. But Abigail could not stop them. As she sewed gold thread into burgundy silk, she allowed herself to wonder if the woman who wore this dress would ever think about who made it. She allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would see her work and recognize that a human being had created it. Not a machine, not a tool, a person with dreams and fears, and a mother she missed terribly. A person who deserved more than this. Spring came to Charleston with its usual explosion of color and warmth. The gardens bloomed. The social season reached its peak. Elanina Whitmore received her burgundy gown and was stunned by its beauty. She had seen fine dressmaking in Boston, in New York, even in Paris during a trip abroad. But she had never seen anything like this. The stitching was impossibly precise. The embroidery depicted flowers that seemed almost alive. The fit was perfect, even though she had only been measured once briefly by Mrs. Peaton's assistant. How had the seamstress known exactly how the fabric would drape? How had she anticipated the way Elanina moved, the way she stood, the way she breathed? It was uncanny. It was unsettling. It was magnificent. Elanina wore the dress to the governor's ball on April 14, 1860. She received more compliments in one evening than she had in her entire 5 years in Charleston. Women begged to know where the dress came from. Men stared openly. Even the governor's wife, a formidable woman who intimidated everyone, approached Elanina to ask about the seamstress. Elanina provided the same vague answers she had received. Paris exclusive, very mysterious. But she was thinking, she was wondering, she was planning. 2 weeks after the ball, Elanina Whitmore did something unusual. She visited Margaret Foster at the Foster townhouse in Charleston. They were not close friends. They moved in, overlapping, but not identical social circles. Margaret was surprised by the visit and flattered by the attention. She served tea and made conversation about the weather, about the upcoming social events, about the election and its implications. Elanina listened and nodded and asked careful questions. She complimented Margaret on her beautiful home. She asked about the lovely curtains in the drawing room. She wondered if they had been made locally or imported. Margaret, eager to impress, explained that she had them made by her own household staff. She had a girl, she said, who was quite handy with a needle. Elanina's heart rate increased, but her face remained calm. A girl handy with a needle. She filed this information away and changed the subject smoothly. They talked about other things for another hour. When Eleanor finally left, she thanked Margaret for her hospitality and mentioned that she might need some alterations done on a few older dresses. Nothing fancy, just some adjustments. Would Margaret's girl be available for such simple work? Margaret hesitated. She did not want anyone to see Abigail. She did not want anyone to connect the girl in the back room with the gowns in Eliza Peaton's shop. But refusing would seem strange. It would raise questions. And the request was for simple alterations, not new creations. Surely that would be safe. Surely no one would look at basic hemming and think anything of it. Margaret smiled and agreed. She would have her girl do the alterations. Elenina should send the dresses over whenever convenient. The dresses arrived at the Foster house 3 days later. There were 4 of them, all needing minor adjustments. Margaret brought them to Abigail's room and explained the situation. Simple alterations, nothing complicated. Get them done quickly and do not make any mistakes. Abigail nodded and took the dresses. She examined them carefully as she always did. 3 of them were ordinary, well-made but unremarkable garments that could have come from any competent seamstress. But the 4th dress made her breath catch in her throat. It was burgundy silk with gold embroidery. She recognized it immediately. She had made this dress. She had spent weeks on it. She remembered every stitch, every decision, every moment of creation. And now here it was back in her hands, needing a small adjustment to the hem. She touched the fabric gently, as if greeting an old friend. Who was the woman who wore this dress? What was she like? Why had she sent it back? Abigail had so many questions she could never ask. She completed the alterations quickly and perfectly, and the dresses were sent back to Eleanor Whitmore. But something had shifted. For the first time, Abigail felt a connection to the world outside her small room. Someone was wearing her creations. Someone was living a life that Abigail could only imagine. And somehow, impossibly, the universe had arranged for one of those creations to return to her, even if only for a moment. Eleanor examined the alterations on her returned dresses with extreme care. She was looking for something specific. She was looking for evidence, and she found it. The stitching on the alterations was identical to the stitching on the original burgundy gown. Not just similar, identical. The same tension, the same spacing, the same distinctive way of finishing a seam that was almost a signature. Eleanor had studied textiles during her education in Boston. She knew that every skilled seamstress developed unique habits and techniques over years of practice. These habits were as individual as handwriting, and the handwriting on these dresses was unmistakably the same. The mysterious French seamstress did not exist. The gowns that were making Margaret Foster wealthy and Eliza Piton famous were being created right here in Charleston, by someone in the Foster household, by a girl who was quite handy with a needle. Elenina Whitmore put down the dress she was examining and stared out the window at the Charleston street below. She had discovered a secret, a profitable secret, a dangerous secret. The question was what to do with it. She could confront Margaret. She could expose the fraud to Eliza Piton. She could tell the other women of Charleston that they had been deceived. But then what? The girl would still be enslaved. The situation would not fundamentally change. Margaret might be embarrassed, might lose her business arrangement, might even face some social consequences. But the girl would still be trapped. Elenina needed more information. She needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. She needed to see this girl with her own eyes. The summer of 1860 was brutally hot in Charleston. Temperatures rose above 90 degrees day after day. The air was thick and humid. Tempers were short. Political tensions were reaching a breaking point as the November election approached. Abraham Lincoln, a candidate from the new Republican Party, was leading in the polls. Southern politicians were openly discussing what they would do if Lincoln won. They would leave the Union. They said they would form their own nation. They would protect their way of life at any cost. Their way of life meant slavery. Their way of life meant people like Abigail Foster working in small rooms, creating beautiful things they would never own for people who would never know their names. The future was uncertain. Everything was about to change. But in her small room, Abigail knew nothing of politics or elections or the forces that were shaping her world. She only knew the fabric in her hands and the deadline approaching and the endless, exhausting rhythm of her days. August brought a development that would prove crucial. Elenina Whitmore arranged to visit the Foster house again, this time with a specific request. She wanted a completely new dress designed and created for a Christmas celebration her husband was planning. She wanted it to be spectacular. She wanted to discuss the design personally with Margaret Foster, and, if possible, with the talented girl who did the household sewing. It was an unusual request. Margaret tried to decline. She explained that the girl was very busy, that she did not work with customers directly, that it would be better if Margaret simply took the order and conveyed the instructions. But Elenina was insistent. She was charming and flattering and absolutely immovable. She simply could not imagine commissioning such an important dress without meeting the person who would create it. Surely Margaret understood. Surely she would make an exception for such an important customer. Margaret was trapped. Refusing would seem suspicious. It might damage the business relationship. It might lead to gossip and speculation. She had no choice. She agreed to arrange a meeting. But she warned Eleanor that the girl was simple, that she could barely speak, that she was not accustomed to dealing with ladies of quality. Eleanor smiled and said she understood completely. She would be patient. She would be kind. She would not expect too much. The meeting was scheduled for August 23, 1860. It was a Thursday afternoon. The temperature was 94 degrees. Eleanor Whitmore arrived at the Foster house, wearing a light cotton dress and carrying a parasol. She was shown into the drawing room, where Margaret was waiting with tea and small sandwiches. They chatted for a few minutes about inconsequential things. Then Margaret rang a small bell, and a door at the back of the room opened. A house servant led in a thin girl with dark skin and large eyes that darted nervously around the room. She was wearing a simple gray dress that was clean but worn. Her feet were bare. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and Elenina could see the calluses and small scars that covered them. This was Abigail Foster. This was the mysterious French seamstress. This was the creator of the most magnificent gowns in Charleston. She was 12 years old. Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. She had known intellectually what she would find. She had suspected the truth for months, but seeing it was different. Seeing this child, this thin and frightened child with damaged hands and eyes that had seen too much, standing in a drawing room, being presented like a curiosity at a fair. Something inside Elenor cracked open and could not be put back together. She wanted to scream. She wanted to grab this girl and run out of the house and never stop running. She wanted to burn Charleston to the ground. Instead, she smiled. She kept her voice calm. She thanked Margaret for arranging the meeting. She turned to Abigail and spoke gently, the way you might speak to a wild animal you were trying not to startle. She said hello. She said she had heard wonderful things about her sewing. She said she would like very much to commission a dress if Abigail was willing. Abigail looked at Margaret for permission before responding. Margaret nodded curtly. Abigail whispered that she would be honored to create a dress for the lady. Her voice was soft, barely audible, as if she had forgotten how to speak at normal volume. Elenina asked about the design. She asked about colors and fabrics and embellishments. She asked questions that required Abigail to think and respond and demonstrate her knowledge. With each answer, Abigail grew slightly more confident. She talked about the weight of silk versus satin, about how certain colors reflected light in ballrooms, about the way embroidery could create illusions of movement. She was intelligent. She was articulate. She was, despite everything, still capable of passion when discussing her craft. Elenina listened and nodded and asked more questions. Margaret watched nervously, ready to intervene if Abigail said anything inappropriate. But Abigail was careful. She had learned to be careful. She answered Elenina's questions about dressmaking without revealing anything about her situation. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. At the end, Elenina thanked both Margaret and Abigail and promised to send detailed instructions for the Christmas dress within the week. She left the Foster house with a pleasant smile on her face and murder in her heart. She walked home through the hot Charleston streets with her parasol protecting her from the sun. And she thought about what she had seen. She thought about what she had to do. She thought about the risks and the consequences and the moral weight of every possible choice. By the time she reached her own front door, she had made a decision. She was going to help that girl. She did not know how yet. She did not know what help would look like or whether it would even be possible, but she was going to try. She had looked into those eyes, those large dark eyes that held so much pain and so much hidden fire, and she had seen a human being who deserved better, a human being who deserved freedom. Elenina Whitmore was not a brave woman by nature. She had spent 5 years in Charleston learning to keep quiet and fit in and not make trouble. But sometimes she was beginning to understand not making trouble was the worst trouble of all. September passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor corresponded with Margaret about the Christmas dress, using the communication as an excuse to request occasional meetings with Abigail to discuss details. Each meeting was brief and supervised, but Eleanor learned more each time. She learned that Abigail's mother was still on the plantation outside the city. She learned that Abigail had been sewing in that small room for over 4 years. She learned that she worked every day from before sunrise until late at night. She learned these things not from direct questions, which would have been dangerous, but from careful observation and inference. She also began to form a plan. It was risky. It was potentially illegal. It could destroy her husband's business, her social standing, her entire life. But she had looked into those eyes. She had seen that child with the damaged hands. She could not unsee it. She would not unsee it. The only question was whether she had the courage to act. October brought the election. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. Charleston exploded in fury. There were protests in the streets, speeches about honor and independence, declarations that the South would never accept a president who opposed slavery. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Other Southern states would follow in the coming weeks and months. The nation was tearing itself apart, and Charleston was at the center of the storm. In her small room, Abigail heard fragments of shouting and celebration from the streets outside. She did not understand what secession meant, but she understood that it was important. She understood that something was changing. Whether that change would help her or hurt her, she could not guess. She could only continue doing what she had always done. She could only survive. 3 days before Christmas, Elenina Whitmore's dress was delivered to her home. It was the most beautiful thing Abigail had ever created. Deep green velvet with silver embroidery, depicting snowflakes and winter branches, a fitted bodice that flattered without restricting, a full skirt that would catch the light from 1,000 candles. Eleanor put it on and stood in front of her mirror, and for a moment she forgot everything else. The dress was extraordinary. It was a work of art. It had been created by the hands of a child who would never wear anything like it, who would never attend a party, who would never dance or laugh or feel beautiful. Eleanor took off the dress carefully and hung it in her closet. She sat down at her writing desk. She took out a piece of paper and she began to write a letter. The letter was addressed to her sister in Boston. It contained coded language that they had developed years ago when Eleanor first moved south. It asked for help. It asked for contacts. It asked about routes and timing and safe houses. It was the first step in a plan that would either save Abigail Foster or destroy Ella Lenina Whitmore, possibly both. Christmas of 1860 was subdued in the Foster household. The political situation had everyone on edge. Richard was worried about the plantation, about the economy, about the possibility of war. Margaret was worried about maintaining her dress business if supplies became scarce. Abigail spent Christmas Day alone in her small room, working on a New Year's gown for one of Eliza Peaton's customers. She was allowed 1 hour to visit her mother in the evening, a concession that Margaret granted more from practicality than kindness. Ruth had been sick for several weeks, a cough that would not go away, and Margaret needed Ruth well enough to work. The visit was heartbreaking. Ruth had grown thin and gray. She could barely stand, but she held Abigail's hands and looked into her daughter's face and told her that she loved her, that she was proud of her, that she believed better days were coming. Abigail wanted to believe her. She wanted so desperately to believe that this suffering had a purpose, that freedom was possible, that she would not spend her entire life in that small room with its sliver of light. But she had been hoping for so long. Hope was exhausting. Sometimes she wondered if it would be easier to stop hoping altogether. Just accept that this was her life. Just accept that nothing would ever change. Just sue and sleep and sue again until she died. That would be easier. But her mother's eyes were on her face. Her mother's hands were holding hers. And she could not give up while her mother still had faith. She would keep hoping. She would keep surviving. She would keep creating beautiful things in her ugly prison and wait for something to change. January of 1861 brought bitter cold and bitter news. More states seceded from the Union. The Confederate States of America began to form. War seemed increasingly inevitable, and Ruth Foster's cough grew worse. By the middle of the month, she could no longer work. Margaret was furious at the inconvenience. Richard wanted to send Ruth to the plantation infirmary, which was little more than a place where sick, enslaved people went to die. Abigail begged. She actually got on her knees and begged Margaret to let her mother stay in Charleston to get medicine, to see a doctor. It was the first time she had ever asked for anything. It was the first time she had ever shown emotion in front of her captors. Margaret looked at the girl kneeling before her. This 12-year-old whose hands had earned the Foster family more money than the cotton plantation, and she made a calculation. Abigail was more productive when she was not distracted by worry. A doctor's visit for Ruth would be a small expense compared to the loss of output if Abigail became too distracted to work properly. Margaret agreed to send for a doctor. It was not kindness. It was business. But Abigail did not care about Margaret's motives. She only cared that her mother would receive help. The doctor came on January 19th. He examined Ruth and shook his head gravely. Consumption, he said, the disease that we now call tuberculosis. It was advanced. There was little that could be done, except make her comfortable. With proper rest and nutrition, she might live 6 months, perhaps a year, perhaps less. The doctor spoke to Margaret as if Ruth were not in the room, as if she were a piece of furniture being discussed for repair. He prescribed some medicines that would ease the coughing. He suggested keeping her isolated to prevent spread of the disease. He collected his fee and left without ever once addressing Ruth directly, without ever once acknowledging her as a human being. That night, Abigail sat alone in her small room and cried for the first time in years. Her mother was dying. The one person in the world who loved her, The one person who remembered that she had once been a happy child, the one person who kept her connected to anything resembling hope, was going to die. And Abigail could do nothing about it. She could only sue and wait, and watch the sliver of light from her window move across the floor as the days passed, counting down toward an ending she could not bear to imagine. And so we leave Abigail Foster in January of 1861 on the brink of war, on the brink of loss, on the brink of either destruction or salvation. She does not know what is coming. She does not know that Elenina Whitmore has been corresponding with abolitionists in Boston. She does not know that plans are being made, risks are being calculated, routes are being mapped. She knows only the fabric in her hands, the ache in her back, the cough from the room where her mother is slowly fading. She is 12 years old. She has created hundreds of beautiful garments that she will never wear. She has made thousands of dollars for people who consider her property. She has never been paid, never been thanked, never been acknowledged as anything other than a tool. And yet somehow she has not been destroyed. She has retained the ability to create beauty in the midst of ugliness, to find meaning in meaningless labor, to love her mother and hope for freedom, and believe that someday, somehow, her life might be different. This is the power of the human spirit. This is what slaveholders could never fully extinguish, no matter how hard they tried. This is what Abigail Foster carried inside her, burning like a small flame in the darkness, waiting for air, waiting for fuel, waiting for the moment when it could finally blaze into light. February of 1861 arrived with freezing rain and devastating news. Fort Sumter, the federal military installation in Charleston Harbor, had become the center of a standoff between the United States government and the newly formed Confederate States of America. Soldiers on both sides watched each other across the water, waiting for orders, waiting for someone to make the first move that would plunge the nation into war. The tension was unbearable. Every day brought new rumors. Every night brought new fears. And in the Foster household, another kind of tension was building. Ruth's condition had deteriorated rapidly. She could no longer get out of bed. She could barely eat. The medicines the doctor had prescribed did nothing except ease her coughing slightly. Margaret had moved her to a small outbuilding behind the main house, partly to prevent the spread of disease, and partly because she did not want a dying enslaved woman visible to her guests. Abigail was allowed to visit once a day in the evening for 30 minutes. These visits were the only thing keeping her sane. She would sit by her mother's bed and hold her thin hand and talk about nothing in particular. She would describe the dresses she was making. She would repeat stories that Ruth had told her when she was small. She would pretend that everything was going to be fine, that the doctor was wrong, that her mother would recover and they would somehow, someday be free together. Ruth played along with this pretense. She smiled and nodded and told Abigail that she was proud of her, but they both knew the truth. Time was running out. Eleanor Whitmore had not been idle during these winter months. Her correspondence with abolitionists in Boston had yielded results. There was a network, she learned, that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. It was called the Underground Railroad, though it was neither underground nor a railroad. It was a series of safe houses, secret routes, and brave individuals who risk everything to help human beings reach free territory. The network extended into the South, though it was extremely dangerous there. Conductors, as the guides were called, could be imprisoned or killed if caught. Those who harbored escaped enslaved people faced similar punishments. And the enslaved people themselves, if recaptured, faced horrors too terrible to describe. Eleanor understood all of this. She understood that what she was contemplating could destroy her life and possibly end it. But she had made her decision on that hot August day when she looked into Abigail's eyes. She was not going to turn back now. The plan, as it developed through coded letters and secret meetings, was complicated. Abigail could not simply run away. She had no papers, no money, no knowledge of the world outside the Foster house. She would be captured within hours. And even if she somehow escaped Charleston, her mother's life would be forfeit. Margaret would sell Ruth to the most brutal plantation she could find, or worse. The escape had to include both Abigail and Ruth. It had to be timed perfectly. It had to account for every possible obstacle. And it had to happen soon, because Ruth was dying, and because war was coming, and because once fighting started, movement between North and South would become nearly impossible. Elenina set a target date of late March 1861. That gave her 6 weeks to arrange everything. 6 weeks to gather supplies, establish contacts, plan routes, and find a way to get Abigail and Ruth out of the Foster house without anyone noticing until they were miles away. It was not enough time. It would have to be enough. Meanwhile, Abigail continued to work. March was always a busy season for dress orders. The social calendar was full of spring celebrations, garden parties, and balls. Eliza Peaton's shop was overwhelmed with requests, and Margaret pushed Abigail harder than ever. 18 hours a day now, sometimes 20. Abigail's hands cramped so badly that she had to soak them in warm water between garments just to keep her fingers moving. Her vision blurred from the constant clothes work. Her back ached constantly, but she did not complain. She could not complain. She could only endure. The one thing that kept her going was the daily visits to her mother. Ruth was fading fast now. She slept most of the time. When she was awake, she often seemed confused, calling Abigail by her grandmother's name or asking about people who had been dead for years. But occasionally there were moments of clarity. Moments when Ruth would grip Abigail's hand with surprising strength and look into her eyes and say something that felt like prophecy. "Freedom is coming," she whispered one evening in early March. "I can feel it. You will be free, my daughter. Promise me you will live. Promise me you will remember." Abigail promised. She did not know how she could possibly keep that promise, but she made it anyway. She would have promised her mother anything. On March 15, 1861, Elenina Whitmore invited Margaret Foster to tea. It was a social call. Nothing unusual, part of Elenina's ongoing effort to maintain access to the Foster household. But this visit had a secret purpose. Elenina needed to see the layout of the house one more time. She needed to confirm where Abigail's room was located, where Ruth was being kept, where the other enslaved workers slept, where the exits were. She memorized everything while chatting pleasantly about the spring social season and the latest political developments. She asked to use the water closet and took a wrong turn on purpose, wandering through parts of the house she had not seen before. She found the door to Abigail's workroom. She found the path to the outbuilding where Ruth lay dying. She calculated distances and timing and lines of sight. By the time she left the Foster house that afternoon, she had everything she needed. The plan could proceed. The date was set for March 26th. It was a Tuesday. Margaret and Richard Foster would be attending a dinner party at the home of a wealthy cotton merchant. They would be gone from the house for at least 5 hours, probably longer. The household staff would be reduced, with most of the enslaved workers given light duties or allowed to rest while the masters were away. It was the best opportunity Elenina would get. She sent a coded message to her contact in the network, a free black man named Samuel, who worked as a driver for a shipping company. Samuel would arrange transportation. He would have a covered wagon waiting 2 blocks from the Foster house at exactly 900 in the evening. Elenina would handle the rest. The days leading up to March 26th were the longest of Elenina's life. She went through the motions of her normal routine, attending social events, managing her household, being the perfect Charleston wife. But her mind was elsewhere. She was running through the plan again and again, looking for weaknesses, anticipating problems, rehearsing what she would say if something went wrong. She barely slept. She barely ate. Her husband Thomas noticed that something was bothering her and asked if she was feeling well. She told him she was fine, just tired from the social season. She hated lying to him. They had a good marriage built on genuine affection and respect. But she could not tell him what she was planning. He would try to stop her. He would say it was too dangerous, too risky, that she was throwing away everything they had built. He would be right about all of that. But he would also be wrong. Some things were more important than safety. Some things were more important than comfort. Elenina had looked into the eyes of a child who had never known freedom, and she could not look away. March 26th arrived gray and cold. A light rain fell throughout the morning, turning the streets of Charleston to mud. Elenina watched the weather anxiously. Rain was actually good for the plan. It meant fewer people would be out and about. It meant less chance of being seen, but it also meant more difficult travel conditions and a greater risk of the wagon getting stuck. She spent the afternoon preparing. She packed a small bag with supplies for Abigail and Ruth, warm clothes, food, water, medicine for Ruth's cough, a small amount of money. She wrote a letter to her husband explaining what she had done and why. She would leave it on his pillow to find when he returned from his own evening engagement. By then, she would either be back home with the plan successfully completed, or she would be in a jail cell facing charges of helping enslaved people escape. Either way, Thomas deserved to know the truth. At 700 in the evening, Elenina put on her plainest dress, a dark gray wool that would not stand out in the night. She covered her hair with a simple bonnet. She wrapped herself in a black cloak. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The Charleston society woman was gone. In her place was someone else, someone harder and braver and more afraid than she had ever been. She left her house through the back entrance and made her way through the rainy streets toward the Foster property. The plan was simple, which meant there were few things that could go wrong. But the things that could go wrong would be catastrophic. She would enter the Foster property through a gap in the hedge that she had identified during her reconnaissance. She would go first to the outbuilding where Ruth was being kept. She would help Ruth out of bed and support her as they walked to Abigail's workroom. She would collect Abigail, and together the three of them would leave through the back of the property and walk to where Samuel was waiting with the wagon. The whole thing should take no more than 20 minutes. 20 minutes to change 3 lives forever. Elenina reached the Foster property at 1830. The house was dark except for a few candles in the servants' quarters. Margaret and Richard had already left for their dinner party. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Elenina slipped through the gap in the hedge and made her way across the muddy garden toward the outbuilding. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were shaking, but she kept moving. She had to keep moving. She reached the outbuilding and pushed open the door. Ruth was awake. She was lying in her narrow bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. When Elenina entered, Ruth turned her head slowly and looked at her without apparent surprise. It was as if she had been expecting this. Elenina knelt beside the bed and spoke quickly and quietly. She explained who she was. She explained that she had come to help Abigail escape. She explained that Ruth had to come too, that the plan included both of them, that there was a wagon waiting to take them north. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Elenina finished, Ruth was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, and her voice was clearer and stronger than it had been in weeks. She said, "I am dying." She said, "I cannot make that journey." She said, "You must take my daughter and leave me behind." Eleanor argued. She pleaded. She said that Ruth could rest in the wagon, that they would get her medical care in the north, that she could not possibly leave her behind. But Ruth was immovable. She knew her own body. She knew how much time she had left. A few days perhaps, a week at most. If she tried to make the journey, she would slow them down. She would require stops and rest and attention. She would increase the risk of capture. And if they were captured because of her, Abigail would be returned to slavery, probably somewhere far worse than the Foster house. Ruth had spent her entire life protecting her daughter. She would not stop now, not even at the end, especially not at the end. There was no time to argue further. Elenina could hear sounds from the main house. Someone was moving around. If they were discovered now, everything would be lost. She gripped Ruth's hand and made a promise. She said, "I will take care of her." She said, "I will get her to freedom." She said, "I will make sure she knows how much you loved her." Ruth smiled, a beautiful and terrible smile that Elenina would remember for the rest of her life. Then Ruth said, "Go," and Eleanor went. Abigail was in her workroom, bent over a piece of silk by candlelight. She looked up in confusion when Eleanor entered. She did not understand what was happening. Why was this white woman in her room at night? Where was Mrs. Foster? What was going on? Eleanor explained as quickly as she could. Escape, freedom, north. Now Abigail's face went through a rapid series of emotions. Confusion, hope, fear, doubt. She asked about her mother. Elenina hesitated for only a second before lying. She said Ruth was too weak to travel tonight, but that they would send for her later once Abigail was safely in the north. They would arrange for Ruth's escape as soon as she was strong enough. It was a kind lie. It was a necessary lie, but it was still a lie. And Elenina could see in Abigail's eyes that she did not entirely believe it. But there was no time for doubt, no time for questions, no time for anything except movement. Elenina grabbed Abigail's hand and pulled her toward the door. Abigail resisted for a moment. She wanted to take something, some memento of her time in this room, some proof that she had existed here. She looked around frantically and grabbed the only thing she could find, a small spool of gold thread that she had been using on her current project. She tucked it into her pocket and followed Eleanor out into the rainy night. They made their way across the garden through the hedge into the street beyond. The rain was falling harder now, which was both good and bad. Good because it concealed them. Bad because Abigail was not wearing shoes and the ground was cold and sharp. She walked as quickly as she could, biting her lip against the pain. Elenina supported her with one arm and scanned the streets for any sign of trouble. They passed 1 block, 2 blocks. They were almost there. Elenina could see the wagon ahead, a dark shape in the darkness with Samuel sitting on the driver's seat. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. And then everything went wrong. A door opened in one of the houses they were passing. A man stepped out onto his porch to smoke a cigar and escape his wife's dinner party for a few minutes. He saw 2 figures hurrying through the rain. One was clearly a white woman. The other was clearly a black child. At 9:00 at night in the rain, without a lantern, without an escort. His mind immediately went to the obvious conclusion. He shouted, He shouted, "Hey there, and stop, and what is going on?" Eleanor did not stop. She grabbed Abigail and ran. The next few minutes were chaos. Eleanor and Abigail sprinted toward the wagon. The man on the porch shouted for someone to stop them. Other doors opened. Other voices joined the commotion. Samuel saw what was happening and snapped the res, bringing the wagon closer to meet them. Eleanor practically threw Abigail into the back and climbed up after her. Samuel whipped the horses into motion before she was even seated. The wagon lurched forward, careening down the muddy street as shouts rose behind them. They turned one corner, then another. Then they were out of the residential district and onto a wider road leading north out of the city. They did not slow down for nearly an hour. Samuel pushed the horses hard, risking injury to the animals and damage to the wagon. Every few minutes he glanced back over his shoulder, watching for pursuit. But the rain and the darkness and the confusion worked in their favor. No one followed. No one organized a chase. By the time the commotion sorted itself out and people began to understand what had happened, the wagon was miles away from Charleston, heading into the low country darkness, where roads became paths and paths became wilderness. It was only when they finally stopped to rest the horses that Eleanor realized Abigail had not spoken a single word since they left the Foster house. The girl sat huddled in the back of the wagon, wrapped in a blanket that Eleanor had brought, clutching the spool of gold thread like a talisman. Her eyes were wide and unfocused. She was in shock. She had spent 4 years in a single room, working from dawn to dark. And now, suddenly she was outside in the rain, in the night, in a wagon, heading toward an unknown destination. Everything she had ever known was behind her. Her mother was behind her. The only world she understood was disappearing into the darkness. Eleanor sat beside her and put an arm around her thin shoulders. She did not say anything. There were no words for a moment like this. She simply held the girl and let her tremble and waited for the shock to pass. They traveled for 3 days, moving mostly at night, hiding during the day in barns and root cellars, and once in a cave that Samuel knew about from previous journeys. The route had been planned carefully by the network. At each stop, there was someone waiting to help them, a farmer's wife who provided hot food, a minister who let them sleep in his church basement, a free black family who risked their own freedom to shelter strangers. These were the invisible heroes of the Underground Railroad, ordinary people who committed extraordinary acts of courage because they believed that human beings should not be property. Abigail watched them all with wonder. She had never known that such people existed. She had never known that white people could be kind, that white people could risk their lives for black people, that the world contained anything besides cruelty and exploitation. Each act of kindness cracked open something inside her that had been sealed shut for years. She began to speak again. First single words, then sentences. Then on the third night, sitting in the basement of a Quaker meeting house, she told Eleanor everything. She told her about the small room. She told her about the dresses. She told her about Margaret's cruelty and her mother's love and the hundreds of garments she had created that were sold to women who never knew she existed. She spoke for over an hour, and when she finished, she was crying. It was the first time she had cried in front of another person since she was 8 years old. They crossed into North Carolina on the 4th day, then Virginia, then Maryland. Each border crossing was dangerous. Each checkpoint was a potential disaster. But the network had done its work well. They had papers forged, but convincing, that identified Eleanor as a widow traveling with her servant girl. They had money for bribes when papers were not enough. They had contacts who knew which routes were safe and which were being watched. And they had luck, the blind, stupid luck that sometimes favors the righteous. On the 8th day of their journey, in the early morning of April 3rd, 1861, they crossed into Pennsylvania, free territory. When Samuel told them they were across the line, Eleanor burst into tears. Abigail simply sat very still, looking at the landscape around her, trying to understand that she was no longer property, that no one here could legally buy her or sell her, or beat her, or force her to work 18 hours a day. That she was for the first time in her life free. But freedom was not the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. Pennsylvania was free territory, but it was not safe for escaped enslaved people. Slave catchers operated there legally and illegally, snatching black people off the streets and dragging them back south. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required Northern citizens to assist in the capture of runaways and impose severe penalties on anyone who helped them escape. Abigail would not be truly safe until she was much farther north, ideally in Canada, where American laws had no power. Eleanor had planned for this. She had contacts in Philadelphia who would take Abigail the rest of the way. But she herself could not continue. She had already been gone too long. Her absence would be noticed. Questions would be asked. She had to return to Charleston and face whatever consequences awaited her. They parted in Philadelphia on April 5, 1861. It was a gray morning with low clouds threatening rain. Eleanor and Abigail stood outside a plain brick house in a quiet neighborhood, preparing to say goodbye. Eleanor tried to speak and found that words would not come. She had known this girl for less than a year. She had spent less than 2 weeks in her company. But something had formed between them, some bond that transcended the vast differences in their circumstances. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside was money. More money than Abigail had ever seen. Enough to help her start a new life. There was also a letter of introduction to a family in Boston who had agreed to help Abigail get an education. And there was one more thing. Eleanor pulled out a small notebook. She explained that she wanted Abigail to write down her story. All of it. Every detail she could remember about her life in the Foster house. About the dresses she had created, about the system that had exploited her. The world needed to know, Eleanor said. The world needed to understand what slavery really meant, what it really cost, what it really did to human beings. Abigail took the notebook and held it against her chest like something precious. She promised she would write. She promised she would remember. She promised she would make sure that her story and her mother's story and the stories of all the invisible people whose labor built the wealth of the South would not be forgotten. They embraced one final time. Then Eleanor climbed back into the wagon with Samuel, and they began the long journey back to Charleston. Abigail watched until the wagon disappeared around a corner. Then she turned and walked into the brick house, into her new life, into a future that she could not yet imagine. 7 days later, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. The nation that had tolerated slavery for nearly a century would now tear itself apart over the question of human bondage. Over 600,000 people would die in the next 4 years. Entire cities would be burned. Entire ways of life would be destroyed. And when it was over, when the smoke cleared and the dead were buried, slavery would be abolished forever. Abigail did not learn about the attack on Fort Sumter until several days after it happened. She was by then in Boston, staying with the family Eleanor had arranged, a Quaker couple named the Hendersons, who had devoted their lives to the abolitionist cause. They took Abigail in as if she were their own daughter. They fed her properly for the first time in years. They bought her shoes and warm clothes. They enrolled her in a school for black children, where she learned to read and write with the same extraordinary aptitude she had shown for sewing, and they told her gently and honestly what she had already suspected. Her mother had died on March 28, 1861, 2 days after the escape. Ruth had held on just long enough to know that her daughter was free. Then she had let go. Abigail spent 3 days in her room after learning of her mother's death. She did not eat. She did not speak. She simply sat by the window, looking out at the Boston street, clutching the spool of gold thread. That was all she had left of her old life. The Hendersons did not push her. They understood that grief had its own timeline, its own rhythm, its own requirements. On the 4th day, Abigail emerged from her room and asked for paper and a pen. She sat down at the kitchen table and began to write. She wrote about her mother. She wrote about the small room in Charleston. She wrote about the dresses and the women who wore them, and the system that had made it all possible. She wrote for hours, filling page after page with her small, precise handwriting. When she was finished, she had the beginning of the document that Eleanor had requested, the beginning of her testimony, the beginning of her contribution to the fight against slavery. The war years were hard for everyone, but they were also years of transformation. Abigail continued her education, proving to be an exceptional student. She learned mathematics and science and history and literature. She learned about the world beyond Charleston, beyond America, beyond everything she had ever known. And she continued to sew. But now she sewed for herself. She created dresses for herself and for the Henderson family and for other members of the abolitionist community. She discovered what it felt like to use her talent freely, without coercion, without fear. It felt like breathing after being underwater for years. It felt like light after endless darkness. It felt like being human. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate states were free. It was a war measure more than a moral statement, designed to weaken the Southern economy and encourage enslaved people to flee their masters. But for Abigail, it meant something profound. It meant that her mother's sacrifice had not been in vain. It meant that the system that had stolen her childhood was being dismantled. It meant that someday, maybe no other child would have to go through what she had gone through. Ilalina Whitmore returned to Charleston in April of 1861, just days before the attack on Fort Sumter. She found that no one suspected her involvement in Abigail's disappearance. The man who had seen them fleeing through the rain had been too drunk to identify her clearly. Margaret Foster was furious about losing her most valuable asset, but assumed that Abigail had run away on her own, possibly with help from other enslaved people. Eleanor kept her secret and watched the war unfold with a mixture of horror and hope. Her husband Thomas eventually learned the truth years later when Eleanor finally confessed. To her surprise and relief, he was proud of her. He said he wished she had told him at the time. He said he would have helped. She never knew if that was true, but she chose to believe it. Margaret Foster's dress business collapsed almost immediately after Abigail's escape. She tried to find other seamstresses who could replicate the quality. But no one could. The mysterious French seamstress was revealed as a fraud when the dresses simply stopped coming. Eliza Peaton was furious and publicly accused Margaret of deceiving her. Margaret's social standing, which she had worked so hard to build, crumbled within weeks. The war made everything worse. The Foster plantation was raided by Union troops in 1863. Their remaining enslaved workers escaped to freedom behind Union lines. Richard Foster died of a heart attack in 1864, broken by the destruction of everything he had built. Margaret survived the war but lost everything else. She spent her remaining years in poverty, living in a single room not much larger than the one where she had kept Abigail, dependent on the charity of distant relatives who barely tolerated her presence. It was a fitting end, perhaps, a kind of justice, perhaps. But Abigail, when she learned of it years later, felt no satisfaction. She felt only a weary sadness for all the lives that had been wasted by the system of slavery, including in some strange way the lives of the slaveholders themselves. The war ended in April of 1865 with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was abolished. 4 million human beings who had been property became legally at least free citizens. The work of Reconstruction began, the long and painful and ultimately incomplete process of rebuilding the South and integrating formerly enslaved people into American society. It would be marked by tremendous progress and tremendous failures, by hope and betrayal, by advances and reversals that continue to shape America to this day. But for Abigail Foster, the end of the war marked a new chapter in her own life. She was 17 years old. She was educated, she was talented, and she was free. In 1866, Abigail moved to New York City and opened a small dressmaking shop in Lower Manhattan. She started with almost nothing, just her skills and her determination and the money Elalina had given her years before. But word spread quickly about the extraordinary quality of her work. Women who had once bought dresses from Eliza Peaton's shop in Charleston, not knowing who had made them, now bought dresses from Abigail Foster's shop in New York, knowing exactly who she was. Some of them sought her out specifically because of her story, which had been published in abolitionist newspapers during the war. They wanted to support a black woman entrepreneur. They wanted to be part of something meaningful. Others came simply because the dresses were beautiful. Either way, they came. And Abigail built something that no one could take from her. She married in 1870 a man named James Washington, who worked as a teacher in a school for black children. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son. Abigail taught all of them to sew, passing down the knowledge that her mother had given her, that her grandmother had given her mother, that stretched back across generations to Africa. But she also made sure they had educations. She made sure they had opportunities. She made sure they knew that they could be anything they wanted to be, that the limitations placed on her generation did not have to apply to theirs. She was by all accounts a loving mother and a devoted wife, but she was also a businesswoman, a community leader, and an advocate for the rights of black Americans. She never forgot where she came from. She never forgot what she had survived, and she never stopped working to make sure that the world became a better place than the one she had been born into. Elalina Whitmore and Abigail Foster corresponded for the rest of their lives. Their letters were long and detailed, covering everything from politics to family to fashion to philosophy. They saw each other in person only a handful of times after the war, but their connection remained strong. When Elalina died in 1889, she left a portion of her estate to Abigail, along with a letter that described the events of March 1861 from her perspective. This letter became one of the most important historical documents of the Underground Railroad, providing a detailed first-person account of how escapes were planned and executed. Abigail added it to her own written testimony, creating a combined narrative that was eventually published as a book in 1895. The book was titled Invisible Hands, and it told the story of enslaved people whose labor created wealth and beauty that was credited to others. It told the story of Abigail Foster, the girl who dressed the elite of Charleston without ever being seen, and it told the story of the countless other invisible hands that built America, that planted and harvested and cooked and cleaned and swed and died so that others could prosper. Abigail Foster died on February 14, 1912, at the age of 64. She had lived through slavery and freedom, through war and peace, through the hope of Reconstruction and the despair of Jim Crow. She had seen tremendous progress and tremendous setbacks. She had watched her country stumble toward justice and then stumble away from it again. But she never lost faith. She never stopped believing that change was possible. She never stopped working for the world. She wanted her grandchildren to inherit. Her funeral was held at a church in Harlem, and it was attended by hundreds of people, black and white, rich and poor, famous and unknown. They came to pay tribute to a woman whose life had embodied the best of what human beings could be. Her son, James Jr., delivered the eulogy. He talked about his mother's talent and her determination and her love. He talked about the small room in Charleston and the long journey to freedom. He talked about the dresses she had created and the lives she had touched and the legacy she was leaving behind. And he talked about the spool of gold thread that his mother had kept her entire life. The one she had grabbed in that frantic moment of escape. The one she had passed down to her oldest daughter with instructions to pass it down in turn. It was a symbol, he said, a reminder, a connection to the past that would never be forgotten. As long as that thread existed, as long as the story was told, Abigail Foster would continue to matter. Her suffering would continue to mean something. Her triumph would continue to inspire. There is a final piece of this story that deserves to be told. In 1985, a historian researching the antebellum dress trade in Charleston made a remarkable discovery. In the archives of a local historical society, she found a collection of receipts from Eliza Peaton's dress shop dating from 1858 to 1861. The receipts documented dozens of sales to wealthy Charleston women with prices and descriptions of each garment, and on the back of one receipt in handwriting that did not match any known sample from Eliza Peaton or Margaret Foster, there was a small note, just 3 words written in a child's hand. Abigail made this. Someone at some point had wanted to leave a record. Someone had wanted the truth to survive. Whether it was a sympathetic house servant or an enslaved worker who assisted in the business, or even Abigail herself during one of the rare moments when she handled completed garments, we will never know. But the words are there. They are preserved in an archive, visible to anyone who cares to look. Abigail made this. 3 words that reclaim a stolen legacy. 3 words that restore an erased identity. 3 words that echo across more than a century and a half to remind us that behind every beautiful thing, there is a human being who created it, and that human being deserves to be seen. The story of Abigail Foster is the story of America. It is a story of cruelty and courage, of exploitation and resistance, of darkness and light. It is a story about what human beings are capable of doing to each other and what human beings are capable of surviving. It is a story that should make us uncomfortable. That should make us question the origins of the wealth and beauty that surround us. That should make us ask who is paying the price for our comfort. Because the truth is that Abigail's story did not end with the abolition of slavery. The truth is that there are invisible hands all over the world right now creating beautiful things in terrible conditions, receiving nothing for their labor, while others profit. The factories where our clothes are made, the fields where our food is grown, the mines where our minerals are extracted, the supply chains that connect our comfortable lives to distant suffering that we prefer not to see. Abigail Foster could not look away. Elalina Whitmore could not look away. They saw what was in front of them, and they acted. Not perfectly, not without fear, not without tremendous personal cost, but they acted. They chose to see the humanity in someone the world had decided was invisible. They chose to believe that one person could make a difference. They chose hope over despair, courage over comfort, action over silence. The question this story leaves us with is simple. What will we choose when we encounter invisible suffering? When we discover the hidden costs of our own comfort? When we are faced with the choice between looking away and looking closer? What will we do? The answer to that question is not just a personal matter. It is the answer that will determine what kind of world our children and grandchildren inherit. It is the answer that will decide whether the story of Abigail Foster is a relic of a distant past or a mirror of our present. Abigail made this. Those 3 words are a challenge and a gift. A challenge.